started by a prompt about the problem of the way in which perhaps we use the city as individuals. I think I mentioned the question of work. The obvious issues somehow that we face in the office in this respect is how our individual buildings come to take part in a wider conversation, and in the absence, I think, of planning that is proactive rather than reactive. I think it's noticeable that as architects and designers, we have ever more a sort of social responsibility to think as arbitrators between the planning system and developers of the public realm and what that represents. And so, yeah, with a trajectory that runs, I know, for Joseph many, many years, and I was intrigued to find in conversation that on your first European trip, you made it with John Turner, who, as a former colleague and student colleague of yours, I think, went on to write a book that was incredibly influential when I was a student, called Freedom to Build. And on the other side, obviously, was your idea of the town, and all the time that elapses from that and its first arrival to the seduction of place. And one senses, underlying all your work, this idea of responsibility to the creation of a social framework as well as an architectural one. And I think in some way that is perhaps where you will spend some of your energy this evening. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, a well-known French psychologist, when accused of repeating himself, said rather fiercely, "I never repeat myself, but I always say the same thing." So I'm just going to say the same thing in slightly different words. We all know that we have a love-hate relationship as an inevitable part of our living in our hometowns. We make our life in our hometown, and are often instinctively and viscerally bound to it, to place at any rate. Yet we are also conscious of their shortcomings, of our hometown shortcomings, and the discomforts which they may impose on us. And quite often we are very vociferous in our complaints about them. What often redeems the hometown for us, and for its citizens generally, is a sense of it as a whole, as a body. Peter Ackroyd, who recently published an account of London, called his book a biography because he wanted to insist on the city's integrity as a living being. London, he writes in the preface, has been envisaged in the form of a young man with his arms outstretched in a gesture of liberation. It has also commonly been portrayed in a monstrous form, a swollen and dropsical giant which kills more than it breeds. But whether we consider London as a young man refreshed and risen from his sleep, or lament his condition as a deformed giant, we must regard it as a human form with its laws and its growth, hence a biography of London. In this, Ackroyd was following many writers to whom the hometown had been just such a living entity. In fact, was appealing to a venerable tradition according to which the settlement from the humble village to a vast city could be considered, even articulated, as a bodily form. A recent and perhaps unexpected witness to such an attitude comes from Corbusier, whom you see here, sitting with a plan of Chandigarh and the modular man. Writing about the plan of Chandigarh last year, the current city architect, Kapil Satya, recalls, he, Corbusier, compared his plan to a human body, with the capital building at its head, the central business district as its heart, and with the industrial areas on the eastern flank and the knowledge and educational areas on the other side as the two arms. We know from his own account in the second modular book that he had himself, as it were, been initiated into such idea by an occultist friend of his, and that he was very surprised when his earlier Indian collaborators, who had been trained in Western schools of architecture, seemed totally ignorant of any such ideas in their own traditions. Yet the figure of a primal man, the primal man whom the Vedas and the Upanishads call Purusha, had for millennia been basic to Indian architectural thinking. A historian of the Hindu temple writes, the head confronting directly the aim of his being, the feet at the opposite end, a schematism in which the figure of man is seen fitted into a square plan of the extended universe, is a workable and not necessarily a visible analogy, an analogy of the whole body of the human being. The idea of such an overwhelming human figure, to which planning and building ideas have often referred, had long been current in much of the world. In this country, it assumed a particular importance when, in the middle of the 17th century, the wordy but brilliant skeptic Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury launched his particular image of the body politic to signify the bond that gives the whole social fabric its connective tissue, which he summed up in his most famous work, Leviathan. How do I go forward?
It should be fine here.
Very good. There it is. That is the title page of his book. And he explains that by art is created that great Leviathan called Commonwealth or State, in Latin civitas, which is but artificial man, though of greater stature and strength than the natural, for whose protection and defense it was intended. The term and the image quickly passed into everyday speech, as well as into popular imagination, in part because it was floated at a time when speculation about the human body and its workings occupied some of the best minds, certainly in this country and probably in Europe generally. Hobbes deliberately invokes the immemorial teaching about the body of man being a miniature and reduction of mankind, indeed of the whole world. The same teaching which centuries earlier, and in very different circumstances, Corbusier also invoked. It was an exalted teaching backed by centuries of usage and explicitly stated by the greatest authority to which both Hobbes and Corbusier could appeal, that of St. Paul, who constantly reminds his hearers that whatever the differences of age, status, or ability between them, they are incorporate in the one body, which is the community of all believers. To the Romans he writes, we have many members in one body, and again, being many, we are one body in Christ. He appeals to that image again and again, to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, to the Colossians. It was the great diversity and equality among believers that made St. Paul insist on the metaphor so urgently. He would call on the metaphor so insistently and confidently because at the time when he wrote, it was already ancient and well tried. The dynamic and complex human body was considered a model of the great universal order of the whole and infinitely varied creation. It had been named microcosm by the Greek anatomist philosopher Democritus of Abdera. At any rate, he was the first to call man microcosmos, a small world. But it was the great Aristotle himself who gave it universal currency when he considered the crucial subject of motion and stillness. And he considers that if any animal may sometimes be perfectly still, motion may occur in that motionless thing from itself and not from anything outside it. From which he concludes that if such a thing can happen in the miniature order of animal, could not the same thing happen in the vast order of the universe? And sums the matter up. If it happens in the microcosm, then it will also occur in the macrocosm. That duality between microcosm and macrocosm became associated with another notion, which had classically and memorably was stated by a slightly older contemporary of Democritus, the poet-physician Empedocles, who hailed from the opposite end of the Greek world, from Acargas in Sicily, which we now call Agrigentum. Empedocles taught that matter in the world was not unified, but was all made up of the four uncreated elements, which he also called rhizomata, roots, water and air, fire and earth, which correspond to the four opposing states of matter, moist and dry, hot and cold. These elements, he further taught, are attracted to each other by love, by philia, and are kept apart by strife. So there's a constant duality in the world which is governed by these two forces, one unifying and the other one separating. This resulted in a fourfold, which is in constant movement and corresponds to the seasons as it does to human temperaments and much else besides. Such a fourfold picture of the world achieved almost universal acceptance. It was debated by later Greek philosophers and by Latin thinkers and poets, as well as by early Christian fathers. It offered a systematic understanding of man and of the world around him, and it was the basis of a vast range of procedures, from elaborate magical prognostication to the understanding of health and disease, and it became the basis of most medical procedures and therapies. Many variations were inevitably played on the basic fourfold scheme. Is that legible? So you see fire, earth, water, and air are in the extreme circles, and they're connected by the months in the outer circles and by the zodiacal signs inside. And then you see in a very prominent place are the four letters A, D, A, M, the name of Adam. This was a book dealing with the date of Easter, actually, but it's a very complicated calculation, and it was written around about 1100 AD in English monastery. And those central four letters are, of course, signify Adam's body, Adam's presence, which was considered to be a spatial image of the whole world, the primal microcosm. St. Augustine had pointed out that the four letters of his name in Greek signify the four directions. Anatole east, Diasis west, Arctos north, Mesimbria south. That's the significance of the four letters. I think the names are written underneath them. That union of the four directions in the name suggests that Adam's body was the whole world summed up, condensed. So if the tiny body of man could be considered an analog of the great body of the world, then surely both were composed of the same elements, and the well-being of both depended on the balance of the elements which were attracted to each other by the force of love, and which was counterbalanced by the separating force of strife or hate. What applied to the physical structure, both of man and of the world, applied analogously to the passage of time through the 4 seasons and the life of man through 4 stages. Space and time were ordered by the same forces. Throughout the Judeo-Christian world, the notion received scriptural backing. In the Genesis account of creation, we are told that God, having made the world and all its inhabitants by a simple fiat, as in "let there be light," created man in his image and likeness by an act of reflection. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. That there might be an image and likeness of the invisible and the ineffable, the transcendent God, was a paradox with which many commentators had to struggle. Yet the scriptural account of the creation of man seemed to offer the suggestion that the human body might offer a guarantee that such an image could be scried from the human body, which, as the pagan ancients had also suggested, could be considered near divine for many reasons. Because man has intelligence and looks up at the sky and the stars, because he stands upright, because he has princely status, a princely nature, and because he dominates animals that are much more powerful physically by the force of his mind. The 2 unions of the microcosm and of the divine image were grafted onto each other by a complex process. Certainly by late antiquity they had grown together. The notion that the 4 elements were analogous to the 4 directions as well as to the 4 seasons, and which governed both time and space, became basic to medical practice, as I suggested, and found support both in Hippocrates, in the huge corpus of writings attributed to Hippocrates, and in Galen's later writings, and remained so until the system was gradually dismantled in the 17th century. It was also on the basis of many images of the microcosm, simpler and much older than the one I have just shown you, and which circulated throughout the Western world. One of the most famous illustrated the work of the encyclopedic writer and preacher, Isidore, Archbishop of Seville, who wrote half a millennium before the image I have just shown you. This is comes from a manuscript written much later, written in honor of a Visigothic king of Spain, a contemporary of Isidore's. But this is near contemporary with the image I just shown you, so it's sort of drawn about 400 or 500 years after Isidore wrote. But it's an image which recurs over and over again. You see, the parallels are between the 4 temperaments. I hope you can read them. Summer corresponds to the choleric temperament, spring to the sanguine, winter to the phlegmatic, and autumn to the melancholy. And these correspond also to the sensible qualities. Fire is hot, air is humid, water is cold, earth is dry. And centrally, and that's quite clearly legible, Isidore puts a triple summation: mundus annus homo, the world, the year, and man. Isidore's message is more explicit in a printed version of the diagram. Right, there you have it. It's from a printed version of late in the 15th century. But some of you may know it as the emblem of the Warburg Institute. When the body is articulated into its parts, each one of them also has its heavenly equivalent. Indeed, in some pictures of the first Adam, he is presented as a figural summation of humanity. This is slightly earlier than the images I've just shown you. You see it's labeled at the top of microcosmos. It takes me a long time to read it all, but the openings of the head correspond to the planets, and the other correspondences are established very much on the lines which I've just shown you. Later illustrations of the same text alternate building and body. It was a familiar notion and figure through the Middle Ages, during which the text of Vitruvius was well known, and it became familiar to scholars and architects through his insistence of a well-proportioned building had to follow the numbers and proportions of a well-built man's body. This association became a familiar discourse, and the illustrations of that notion became a commonplace of architectural thinking, with which I won't bother you, because most of you will be familiar with it. It was against this background that we can look at the drawing of the great Sienese painter and architect and fortification engineer Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who offers the male human body. It's actually said to be an idealized self-portrait, but I can't guarantee that. Who offers the male human body as a model of a fortified city at the opening of his of the second version of his great treatise on building. And he comments on it all too briefly. Of course, he refers again to Vitruvius. As Vitruvius tells us, all our skill and method must be drawn from the human body. Since nature has shown that the face is the noblest member and that the seeing eye must judge the whole of the body, the castle similarly must be the eminent place so that it can see and consider the whole of the city. And he captions, you see there, little captions are just about legible on this slide. The figure of the body in which is circumscribed the city and the distribution. And he draws the labels of the parts. The castle, the towers, the temple, and the piazza. The body of the town, the gate, the artwork, and the ravelin. He does not need to provide much other explanation, but he does clearly show the marketplace as the stomach of the city and the church as its heart, while the wall and towers are analogous to hands and feet, much as in Corbusier's diagram of Chandigarh, the hands and feet were the working parts of the town. But the image of the stomach as the market of the city brings to mind an important consequence, or perhaps more accurately an implication of my original metaphor, which later commentators have been reluctant to draw, that the body politic, like every individual's own body, ingests, and having ingested must also eliminate waste matter. These functions, neglected nowadays in the urbanist discourse, seem to me to be integral to the body politic metaphor which I have been invoking. Thomas Hobbes, whom I quoted at some length and is the originator of the mechanistic treatment of it, certainly did not shy away from such implications. He devoted a whole chapter of his Leviathan to what he called nutrition and procreation of a commonwealth. He extends these to concoction and preparation as well as conveyance of such material stuffs as the body politic needs for its subsistence. But he really treated such notions as metaphoric of the economy of the settlement, the supply of manpower and money, while procreation seemed to him a metaphor of colonization. So to him, all these functions were really entirely metaphoric. They didn't relate closely to the body functions at all. Such metaphoric distancing was more improper when the late 18th century biologists had identified 4 functions as essential to the body's existence. Ingestion and evacuation were paired in the concept of digestion. The other 3 were circulation, breathing, and movement. So for the 4 elements, we have 4 functions. And that preponderance of the functional understanding of the body over the mechanical metaphor implied, almost inevitably, the closer attention of thinkers and scientists to the involvement of the functions in the understanding of urban form. Some artists were accurately aware of the interdependence of the ingesting city with its hinterland. It is a relation which appears almost idealized by Giovanni Bellini in the background of his painting. This is the Madonna of the Meadows in the National Gallery in London. It's the detail, you only see a detail of her coat on the slide. The painting was done about the same time as Francesco Di Giorgio's drawing. It shows the Madonna seated in landscape with the settlement walled like the city of Francesco's diagram, in closest relation to land, which is being cultivated for the food it will consume. This relation was often racked by war and its effects, and there's another side to the relationship with the walls and towers of Francesco Di Giorgio's walls. They are perhaps inevitably implied. There are the peasants working the land, and you see the fortress in the background, the fortified town in the background. The workers in the fields need the security that was offered by the fortified settlement. They are always conscious of the protection they offered against marauding or even highly organized, disciplined troops who would raid them to feed themselves. The relationship was organic and essential. The ingesting and excreting settlement needs demand such a hinterland. And for centuries, that hinterland started at the stone or brick, sometimes even at wooden defense works. That relation was drastically, if gradually transformed, by the development of artillery after 1500, after the death of Francesco. And the once linear defenses were extended, and the rigid lines were swelled into earthworks that had to contain some of the hinterland and increase the amount of cultivated, even arable terrain. You see the enormous amount of arable terrain within the walls. This is Stefano Bonsignori's plan of Florence of 1584. The beleaguered city had to be able to feed itself, so the hinterland was actually included into it. Yet from the outset of husbanding, some 10,000 years ago or more, it was understood that fresh food would not be available the year round, but also that there will always be proportions of the produce that cannot be consumed as it is harvested. Moreover, a portion of grains and pulses had to be held back for seed, and this because in years and times bad harvest, the temptation was always to raid it, had to be protected by all sorts of ritual and penal sanctions. The drying of grains and pulses, methods of salting and smoking fish and meat were widely known and were successfully practiced since the remotest antiquity. The preserving of the seasonal output of the hinterland and of marketing animal products, the Baltic salt herring exported south was one of the sources of Hanseatic wealth. Such methods of preserving seasonal products and of marketing surplus developed slowly until the end of the 18th century, when they suffered a cataclysmic change from which we are still not recovered, because of the application of certain scientific techniques in the kitchen, which led to rapid advances in the methods of preservation. Between 1795 and 1820, methods of high temperature cooking and hermetic sealing of the food in glass containers were developed, which later changed to tin boxes and was patented in England. In 1823, a similar method was patented in the US of A. These inventions remained in the realm of luxury food until the arrival of quite different technologies, which had nothing directly to do with sustenance, but which completely transformed the demand of food supply. This happened in the middle of the century. The first, announced in 1851, no, not yet, was the safety elevator, followed in time by the development of structural skeleton, which began to displace structural steel skeleton, which began to displace the earlier and much more cumbersome cast iron version. All this is very familiar to you. Together, these two devices or inventions equipped the rising cities of the second half of the 19th century with ever higher buildings, which would be filled almost instantly with tenements and with administrative offices for the rapidly growing industries of commerce, all of which the old kind of hinterland could no longer supply with food in adequate quantities. Feeding the new tall cities demanded vast and sometimes remote terrains. In Cincinnati, the pork capital of America, and then in Chicago, industrialized slaughtering was perfected. And that in turn demanded the herding of vast cattle swarms, not on the continent's central prairies, on which buffaloes had grazed, sustaining the Amerindians which hunted them. To cope with the catastrophic rise in demand, the early food conservation techniques were found to be inadequate, and new technologies were soon devised. First, refrigeration. Now we change. Which brought quick-chilled meat to the new and fast-expanding urban population. The first refrigerated railway wagon was patented in 1867, which is slightly earlier than this illustration, is about 1870. In 1876, a meat-carrying ship, Le Frigorifique, crossed the Atlantic, making Chicago pork and beef available in France. Another invention, converting the food-preserving techniques developed at the beginning of the century into mass production terms, was the tin can. Wilson's patented corned beef can was patented in 1875. It was soon ceded to the big money, which moved into the meat business. Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift formed the National Packing Company in 1905, by which time the relation between settlement and hinterland had been radically transformed. And now the peas which you or I buy in a London supermarket, which are obliged to declare their origin, may come from Kenya or from Chile. The bulk of such long transport and commercially traded products has to be produced with the aid of synthetic fertilizer, which had been increasingly used since Justus Liebig first investigated the chemical constitution of manure in the mid-19th century, even if he himself considered the organic nature of natural fertilizer, as did Karl Marx, much superior to his chemical product. Long-term reliance on intensive chemical cultivation has impoverished soil in some parts of the world. So the interdependence of refuse-producing settlements and its hinterland has become a new kind of issue, and the old image has acquired a new urgency. It brings to mind an important implication of the metaphor, which some commentators have been reluctant to draw, that the body politic, like the individual body, ingests, and having ingested, it must of course eliminate great quantities of waste matter. That process has been a persistent and noisome trouble over centuries. The contents of cesspits were collected and transported out of towns, their spillage a source of recurrent epidemics and plagues, while the vast quantities of horse droppings, which were the inevitable byproduct of urban transport, had also to be avoided. Both provided the bulk of the fertilizer for the urban hinterland and were a very obtrusive presence in urban life. But it did finally seem as if the problem of urban waste could be solved mechanically in the rational city of the Enlightenment. Throughout the 18th century, the water closet, first devised in Elizabethan England, was perfected, remedying private inconvenience, but contributing to some very public ones, since private soil could never quite successfully be carried out to an underground duct which conveyed far enough to sea. Nevertheless, a French Enlightenment writer, Pierre Pat, in a memoir on the most important aims of architecture, which was published in 1769, provides a strange section in which really has at the center the urban sewer, which carries both stormwater at the bottom, and as you see, soil from the earth closets down one drain, and you see the stormwater duct on the other. What you don't see very clearly in the slide, I'm afraid, is the mains water carrying pipe, which is about halfway up and is isolated from the rest of the sewer. So Pat in 1769 was already foreseeing the possibility of a sewer which would carry both, the carrying of both mains, main storage and main supply in the same underground duct. When Pat wrote, most of everyday urban detritus would still be carried out of the city. His proposal was really a proposal for the future. Carried out of the city as fertilizer. But as the 19th century advanced, the water closet, instead of providing the final solution to the urban waste problem, became a contributor to urban blight. In London, notably, where the tidal Thames produced the reflux, the new drainage, in fact, contributed to the repeated cholera epidemics and the crisis came when, during the summer of 1858, the foul smell of the river pervaded the city. It was called the Great Stink, and it led to panic legislation, as a result of which the great drains on either side of the river were built, which have since been the structural actors in the fabric of London. Circumstances were different in Paris, where a program of mains building was started under the first Napoleon and extended ever more thoroughly through the 19th century, and its installation even became showpieces of public utility. But the solid waste did build up on the riverbed, partly because, of course, the Seine is not tidal. And some engineer reformers instituted a system of filtration which pulled the solid waste near the Clichy bend of the river, where hundreds of acres were intensely cultivated with human waste, producing the best vegetables available in Paris. And although this was started in the 1840s and 50s, it was certainly visited by Napoleon III secretly. He was offered a great deal of produce as a present. The enterprise went on working profitably until it was costed out by real estate speculation a couple of decades ago. The issue was taken up in Germany by a succession by organic propagandists, of whom Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, was probably the most famous. Many of the agricultural activists were agitating for the recycling of urban waste, particularly of human waste. Evacuation, the disposal of waste matter, has now become increasingly bulky, and their mismanagement a disfiguring stain on the image of the city, which has allowed much of it to be taken over by organized crime rather than by legitimate trade. So that the whole business of recycling, which was taken for granted in the pre-industrial city, however uncomfortable and obtrusive its workings became, has turned into an unmanageable problem. This may be why the managing of excreta, among other urban detritus, has become an obsessive concern, which is obvious in the work of some artists. Images of people involved in various intimate concerns, even in bad behavior of some kinds, have always been found representation in art, though excretion, when shown, has been marginal. So that rare public representations became notable curiosities, like the mannequin piss of Brussels. The statue was actually dates to about 1620 and supplied drinking water to the Bruxellois and wine and beer at festive occasions since the 12th century. But it's unique. If you think of all the nude figures on the fountains spread throughout Europe, not one of them is involved in this activity. A very different kind of attention was focused on such matters by artists. therefore. It started in a way in 1917 when Marcel Duchamp bought a very ordinary but now famous urinal, which is submitted as a sculpture titled Fountain to the Independence exhibition, the Independence show, in the Grand Central Palace of New York in 1917. It was also the very first ready-made, an object which is a work of art because declared such by an artist. And although it was refused by the show's committee, it has become one of the most celebrated objects in the art world. Performance artists have made a point of urinating into it publicly on several occasions during the 90s. While in 1991, Sheda Levine, who was a noted copier of artist work, that is the nature of her contribution, made a copy of it in stainless steel. But fascination with the lower functions persisted among the surrealists and was taken up by the conceptual artists after the war. In 1961, Piero Manzoni had 88 cans, each containing 30 grams of his own feces, unadulterated by additives, as the label says, in delicately labeled Künstlerscheiße Artist Shit Merde d'Artiste, published or shown or perhaps marketed. He established the price at the equivalent in 18-karat gold value, which would by now be worth some 700 euros at current gold prices, although recent auction prices rate one tin at 220,000 euros, so 3 or 4 times the value he established. Both the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Tate Gallery have a tin each, and they are labeled sculpture. The British artists Gilbert and George, who unlike Manzoni have no sense of irony, display enlarged images of their feces. This panel is 2 meters high. Directly at the spectator. Now they made about 40 or 50 varieties on this panel. They're very big. They're big plastic panels illuminated from behind. I think there's one in the Tate, but I can't guarantee. Well, about the same time, the politically committed but very fastidious and elegant artist Richard Hamilton, in his painting Citizen, commemorated the imprisoned Irish nationalist hunger striker Bobby Sands, who had smeared the walls of his cell with his own feces as part of his protest. Such symptomatic concerns with individual body detritus and other body fluids among contemporary artists could be multiplied indefinitely. Arguably, it is a later derivative of artists' awareness of social as well as individual refuse and body fluids. But then detritus in all its forms has been something of an irritant for over a century. At the beginning of the 20th century, artists had begun to take an almost aesthetic interest in all the dross and scoria of urban life, of social excreta. They looked at scraps of everyday things to assemble into images of lyrical power. In the collage, which was one of the which soon after 1910 became the commonplace of Cubist artists. This is Picasso using a thrown away cane seat as the basis of a collage. The Cubist collages of Picasso and Barac were discontinued during the war, but were taken up by the Dadaists. This is called Schwitters in 1922. He made them his principal productions, and many other artists followed. The paradox has not escaped the attention of artists like Robert Rauschenberg, whose combines were mostly constructions of stuff picked off rubbish bins. Interestingly enough, he had an exhibition of them in Houston, and the material from which he made his combines were all collected from rubbish dumps, and the ones he didn't he didn't manage to sell in the gallery, he threw back on the rubbish dump. So there was a kind of exchange. The more economically and industrially developed our cities, the more the waste products, which not only occupy increasing areas of outer suburbs as well as waste ground, and were built up and also bulk exported, they are recognized as containing much valuable material, so that scavenging has become a trade, even a profession in some parts of the world. So there is this double take. Some of the rubbish is collected, sorted through, and recycled. Some becomes profit for the criminal elements. A new class of scavengers, therefore highly organized in some places, grown up to pick over detritus and to manage and incidentally recycle much of it. Some artists turn their attention to mechanical rather than personal detritus, and have even collaborated with refuse gatherers and scavengers to weld the fragments into novel and unexpected compositions. Some of you may remember this. This is the Royal Academy in London. This is a big hanging by Elena Natsui, who was one of the best known artists in my generation, a Ghanaian who has worked for many years in Nigeria, and has found a way to weave bottle tops and pieces of tin can into what seem like precious tapestries. Perhaps even more ambitiously, the Indian architect Sanjeev Shankar has made can tops and bottles into constructive materials of a complex structure. These kind of operations may seem marginal, but they do illustrate what we have artists for, after all, to make us aware of our environment and its relation to the society that produces it, and therefore also of the value of the potential, the value and the potential of much that we have despised, ruined, and wasted. I do hope that some of the images I have shown you may point to a turn in our social perception. Our sense of the city as a working unit, and therefore any sense of a vital urbanity, has been dislocated somewhere between the western shores of the Persian Gulf and the Pacific coast of China, where all matters of provisioning of waste are treated as marginal and mechanical concerns, which may result in its byproducts turning much more toxic than other detritus. Sociologists keep on telling us and they garnish it with other dispiriting statistics of population growth and the dissolution of the town in a homogeneous habitat. But the disciplines seem incapable of helping us to approach the problems of place and form with which I've been concerned. We've for years been told that Boswash was going to amalgamate into a continuous town. And yet if you talk to inhabitants of Baltimore or New Haven, they're certainly aware of their own settlements as separate from that vast conglomerate. Such political and economic as well as architectural concerns are the inevitable concomitant of the city project, and therefore a vital entity, present the city as a vital entity, not as a corpse to be autopsied, which they sometimes seem. Our exemplars will not always be the officially organized municipalities, but may well be found in such places as the slums and rubbish dumps of Mumbai, which is, instructively, about halfway between my two extreme disurbanities, the Gulf states and the Pearl River Delta. And although new inhabitants arrive daily in their thousands, Mumbai manages to register the lowest water and energy consumption of any world city, as well as the highest population density. It also produces remarkably little waste, since the slums are themselves a recycling plant. No one in their right mind would offer the Mumbai slums as a model of urban development. We have more severe and more wholesome models on offer, though they do seem to lack any integrating scenario. That is why the image of the city as a border construct, hoary and remote though it must seem, may prove relevant to our situation. The images I have shown you are perhaps only straws in the wind, which I have chosen to read optimistically as indicating a reevaluation of urban detritus, and with it a rethinking of recycling as well as related issues of provisioning and consumption, which really brings me back to the metaphor with which I started. The body politic as a working organism in which all its mechanical workings, respiration, circulation, consumption, elimination, are understood as essential functions of its existence, around which we will be able to reformulate an urbanism in which everyone will find their proper and balanced place. I have been overly optimistic, I'm aware, and I have talked far too fast, I'm afraid, so I've stumbled occasionally, but I hope the bulk of what I had to say has been clear.